filling the shoes of a great man. From the Shower Posse to the presidential clique. By 1992 the Shower Posse was already marked for death. No longer were they under the radar, they had outgrown that years ago. They had drawn the attention of the US federal authorities. Task forces were created just to focus on their activities. Their bloody and illegal influence and activities extended throughout the United States and Canada, reaching into cities and states such as Anchorage, Detroit, Kansas, New York, Rochester, Daytona, Ohio, Toronto, and Montreal. They had arrived. They had made the federal radar, and were now firmly under the spotlight, and according to revelations that came years later, had actually been for years, just not the scale that they now were. Once upon a time this wasn't so, but with all their crazy stunts, nightclub shootings, park shootings, bus ride shootings and on goes the list, and with Jim Brown dead, and Vivian Blake on the run. The light had only gotten brighter as DUDUS took control of the reins of the community, which was the literal source responsible for creating and replenishing such a notorious organization. This was also a very fickle time in the ranks of law enforcement, both locally and internationally when it came to anything posse-related, because with Jim Brown dead, the international law enforcement agencies who desperately wanted to get him in front of a judge, were fuming, biting at the bits, so this was definitely not the time to be identified as the head of such an organization, and DUDUS was quite aware of that, and made every effort to disassociate himself and his affairs from anything Shower Posse related. A development, it is said, which led to the creation of a new entity, the presidential clique. DUDUS had lived throughout his father's reign as Tivoli Gardens top man, and he had seen just how things worked, up close and personal, and except for Jati, he was actually the closest son to the action. He had also seen just how the people revered his father and what it had taken to maintain that level of respect and admiration, and he not only desired it, he was determined to maintain and enhance it even further. The way he saw it, according to those who were around at the time of the presidential clique conception, when it came to donship, the pinnacle in his mind was Jim Brown, and DUDUS was not trying to replace Jim in terms of just a new don, replacing an old one. No. His legend would live on, especially with chatter circulating that Jim might not really be dead, and that the fire incident was an elaborate hoax, staged for one reason and one reason only, to make sure he never faced prosecution in the United States. Note, arguments of this nature have become the substance that folklores are made of. Because even though there has never been any evidence to support such a theory, in certain circles, this is still believed to be true. Jim Brown is not dead. None of this was news to DUDUS, he knew all that was being said and then some, but like a true strategist, he simply decided to make it all work to his benefit. He was the new Don, that was a given. But he would go by a different title, one that would sever old alliances, show his status, and at the same time, leave the memory and caliber of his father intact. His father had been considered the Don of all Dons, although it was said that he answered to an even more powerful Don, Mr. Siaga. From the inception, DUDUS was having a problem with Mr. Siaga. So not only was his proposed title of the president supposed to distinguish him from all his predecessors, but it was also a clear indicator of his defiance towards Mr. Siaga's authority. According to sources, the way DUDUS saw it, the entire power of Jamaica Labour Party, JLP, relied on Tivoli Gardens and West Kingston and not on the Jamaica Labour Party and its politics, and if he is to tell it, he was the one in charge of the mentioned locales and their environs. So the only logical question was, who was really in charge then? Things had changed. Another factor that must also be highlighted here is that the use of the title, President, also came about because of the reputation of the Tivoli Gardens organization, the Shower Posse, and their impact in the United States. Consequently, it is said that the influence and power DUDUS had inherited was seemingly way more than that of Jamaica's ultimate power source, except for the Governor-General, the Prime Minister himself. Therefore, what more befitting title than the President was there for the new Don? Political reality of the day, Tivoli Gardens was the JLP's political stronghold, led by Mr. Siaga, and what was said in Tivoli had reaching effects, right across the island, even able to influence developments, oceans away. That was just the way it was, and everyone knew it. Everyone, including DUDUS. And with this awareness, DUDUS not only became more defiant, he started scheming. From day one it was clear that DUDUS was going to be a Don unlike his father, and way different than Massop ever was. The usual modus operandi of Dons before DUDUS was that the Don always had a dozen or more men around him all the time. These were bodyguards, triggermen, associates and hangers-on, who in most cases would be willing to die if they had to, on his behalf. Then to make it even more complicated, although the Don was the one in charge of almost everything around him and had the final say in literally all matters, in and around his power base, there was no, and could not be any open-door policy. You couldn't just want to talk to the Don and it happened, unless you were someone in the mix, in the higher echelon of the streets, some business interest of his, or of some caliber when it comes to common political affiliation. If you weren't any of those, and at times, even if you were, there was still a system of stringent scrutiny in place. This at times involved, but was not limited to, the relaying of messages to one or several lieutenants before getting to speak to the Don directly. With DUDUS, not too much changed in most of those areas. If anything they got more stringent, but he was no fool. He saw the mistakes and accomplishments of those before him. It was as if he had the manual of all manuals to read when it came to garrison gangsterism, and just like when he attended Arden High School, Michael Christopher Koch was an astute student. In the inception of his takeover, DUDUS was leery, but he couldn't seem scared. He was about change, but he also knew that too much change, too fast, can become extremely detrimental, especially when dealing with individuals of a certain background and mentality. And with this in mind, he made what was the equivalent of a power move in the corporate world. DUDUS carved up the underworld, empowered many, while still maintaining ultimate control over all. A power move that captured the hearts and minds of the masses, as he inched closer and closer to his ultimate desire, being the president of the underworld. He was in campaign mode. Donship, or a level of importance it seemed was desired by most youths in the ghetto who were trapped in the depressing reality of their day-to-day existence. If not that, they at least desired respect and a piece of the pie, even if that piece of the pie meant nothing more than a new pair of shoes or a few pieces of trendy apparel, every now and then add a few dollars to the mix, and their fate was sealed, absolute loyalty to the Don. DUDUS realized the importance of this simple principle of garrison philanthropy from early. He knew that the simplest expressions of generosity in the ghetto could mean the difference between life and death, loyalty and disloyalty. It was just what it was, and he had seen this principle at work many times before, both from a political and a social standpoint. The desires of individuals were the same, and the results were always the same if those desires were met or not met. DUDUS had a plan. Empower them, so they can empower themselves, while also empowering him in return, while at the same time, without them even realizing it, becoming loyal subjects in the process. This was DUDUS' plan, simply Machiavellian in nature, and it worked like a charm. He was from a different school of thought, from a different era, so it was only natural that his approach was different. Unlike previous Dons who had relied mostly on brute force, DUDUS' approach was actually political, much like he had seen work in the bigger scheme of things. His approach may not have been political in the true sense of what politics really entails, but irregardless, his move to galvanize his power base was straight from the pages of what seemed like the Jamaica Parliamentary Handbook. DUDUS knew that most factions in varying garrisons, who were aligned with the JLP, were simply that, factions. They were weak and disorganized, but at the same time, they all had the potential to be extremely loyal if given the opportunity, maybe even more than those he had known all his life. He also knew that most of these factions not only looked up to Tivoli Gardens, but would be forever indebted if they were given a coveted endorsement, so he gave it to them, gave them what they wanted, while taking what he desired. They wanted association and the opportunity to earn, and he wanted soldiers for his army. The more the merrier, and the farther and wider they were, even better. Unlike previous dons, DUDUS's aim was to use a common cause and extend the empire he had inherited to unimaginable heights. His nifty power move brought about the creation of multiple hand-picked dons from various communities, in and around Jamaica's capital, but it didn't stop there. His reach was eventually extended all over Jamaica, reaching as far as the tourist capital of Montego Bay. Needless to say, all these dons who were invited to be a part of the newly formed criminal brotherhood, were all more than eager for an alliance with Jim Brown's son, the heir to the Shower Posse throne, and from their perspective, quite possibly the most powerful don to ever walk the streets of Jamaica. The president kept it simple. He empowered them financially, sharing contracts, opening businesses in various areas of their control, businesses that they controlled but were either owned by DUDUS or his close affiliates. If that wasn't the case, then they had shares in said establishments, bars, restaurants, car marts, grocery stores, and on goes the list. This worked for literally all the men who were invited to dine at the Don's table. To most this was like the opportunity of a lifetime, because in most cases, they weren't doing so well in the financial realm to begin with. Keep in mind that at this time, the PNP was in power, their party, the JLP was in the opposition position, so offers like these were literal no-brainers, and then add the direct link to, and the backing of Tivoli Gardens to the mix, and DUDUS had a standing, unified force, from far and wide. In short succession, DUDUS not only controlled Tivoli Gardens and Western Kingston as a whole, he also directed activities in other areas across Jamaica, far and wide, in a way that was never seen, done or even attempted before. With his backing, his external dons became stronger in the realms under their control, and they in return, made him mighty. He had learnt well, formed the political mechanism of the day, and now the blueprints were in his hands. Suddenly he was the new architect in charge of the project, and almost instantly, DUDUS embarked on what could only be described as, the creation of many replicas of what has been dubbed, the mother of all garrison, Tivoli Gardens, all across the island, more for his advantage than to anyone else's. With him being who he was, almost all were eager to line up and play do as I say, but DUDUS was different in every way. He was about more than just issuing political commands. He wasn't even all that enthused by politics, because in his book, it made no difference who was elected, what mattered was that he was in power, an entirely different outlook from that of all his predecessors. Case in point. The Jamaica Labour Party, in 1992 had not been in power since they lost the general election to the PNP in 1989, but they, residents of Tivoli Gardens and members of the Shower Posse, were still able to do as they pleased, so in DUDUS's book, it didn't make that much of a difference who was actually elected. This was beyond politics, this was business, and all he had to do was maintain and build on what was already in place. One of DUDUS' key sayings, and also what eventually became somewhat of a principle in his life, was the age-old adage, money over war, a simple sentiment that made all the sense in the world to almost everyone who heard it, and with him not only sounding good as he uttered those words, but backing them up with actions that brought forth monetary results. This just made his followers even more eager to follow him. The newly endorsed dons loved DUDUS. Not only was he who he was also a man of his word. If he said it, then that settled it. A straight shooter who didn't have to say it twice to make a point. Keep in mind, this was 1992 and almost everything that was said to be legal could be found in the Tivoli Gardens, the headquarters, yet another name for Tivoli. DUDUS was in charge. That simply meant he had plenty to dispense as he saw fit, and he did just that. What was once reserved only for Tivoli Gardens residents, had now found ways into other politically like-minded communities, and the dons from those enclaves loved every moment of it. It must also be noted that most of what DUDUS had at his disposal at this time, had little or no political strings attached to it. DUDUS was spending his own money, not the JLP's. Name it, and if Tivoli Gardens had it or got some, best believe if you were a part of the system, yours was on the way, and it didn't matter what it was either. Guns, clothes, motorcycles, whatever. That was just how DUDUS ran his operation, and the dons loved him, imposing his every desires on those under their authority, with authority. The mindset of this regime was different, making it so much easier to follow the leader or just go along with the flow. DUDUS rarely interfered in their day-to-day activities, that was for his underlings, and with them being endorsed and empowered in their respective zones, and having the backing of such a force, these dons had no problem answering only to one outside of their realm, especially when the one in question was DUDUS himself. Such moves and achievements not only elevated DUDUS to unprecedented levels, but it also solved his problem of having to be too visible and feeling too vulnerable, and in short, it gave him a new and extended arm of protection that went way beyond the borders of Tivoli Gardens and its environs, a system to him, which if was in place to begin with, may have been just what was needed to save both his brother and sister's lives. Noteworthy facts. The death of DUDUS' brother, JT, led to an eruption of violence that left 20 dead in its wake. Interestingly enough, this flare-up of violence all started in the emergency room of the Kingston Public Hospital, when residents from Tivoli Gardens decided to avenge the death of their don, who they felt was not given the needed assistance by doctors and nurses to save his life. The enraged mob at the time threatened to kill at least 50 nurses and doctors for the don's demise. Within hours of word spreading about JT's death, Jamaica was again gripped with a headline of grotesque magnitude, when gunmen from Tivoli Gardens invaded the neighboring PNP community of Hannahtown. The mob unleashed its fury on the residents with a barrage of gunfire, rape and pillaging, all in the name of taking vengeance on behalf of their fallen don, Mark Anthony JT Coke. Additional facts. Approximately 3 weeks after JT was killed, he, like all dons before, was given the traditional state-like funeral, with all the theatrics and pageantry that could be imagined. Mr. Seaga, leader of the then opposition party, the JLP, led the 20,000-plus procession of mourners, mostly young men and women dressed in the trendiest fashions of the day that money could buy, and adorned with what appeared to be hundreds of thousands in gold jewelry. JT's girlfriend, popularly known as Foxy, was seen walking beside Mr. Seaga, looking foxier than ever in a tight-fitting black dress, which left little to mourn over. JT was sent off to the hereafter looking mighty dapper himself, decked out in a regal-looking black velvet suit with a white stained shirt inside, and according to some, never looked better alive. His casket, black with silver handles, cost a then whopping 40,000 Jamaican dollars, a handsome sum by any estimate in 1992. Mr. Seaga was lambasted in the local press for not only attending, but leading the funeral procession of a well-known thug. But again, what was done was done. Tragic irony. On the very same afternoon that JT was buried, his father, Jim Brown, was burnt to death in his cell under what has since been widely accepted as questionable circumstances. The key fuel to many a debate, and all speculation that followed. Jim Brown had lost his extradition fight. The British Privy Council had denied his extradition appeal, and US drug enforcement agents were already on the ground, in Kingston, waiting to put Brown on a jet bound for Miami. Brown had vowed that should he be extradited and have to stand trial in the US, he would tell all that he knew, not only about the Shower Posse, but about Mr. Seaga and the Shower Posse, which was rumored to have actually been the brainchild of Mr. Seaga himself. It is also said that the very name Shower was actually coined by Mr. Seaga himself. as a counter to the PNP's verbal slogan, "Power," in the bloody run-up to the 1980 general election, which some say found the JLP shooting its way to victory, which again is also another element that adds an unholy mysticism to the origin of the posse's name, as it is also said that shower was an alleged description of what the JLP henchmen would do, or did to their enemies, shower them with bullets. Jim Brown's one-time cellmate and several other inmates incarcerated on the same general penitentiary block at the time, have made claims that on more than one occasion they heard him utter the now infamously chilling words, "Mek dem gwa man, dem make a sad mistake if dem feel see me alone go dung," translated, "It's all good, but they've got it twisted if they feel I am the only one going down." This was a powerful man, uttering some powerful words, the likes of which is said to have had quite a few individuals shaking in their boots. Ironically, no one was ever charged for setting the fire that killed Brown. Officially, it was said to have been accidental, caused from some type of flammable liquid which Brown was allowed to have in his cell. But according to the streets, both Vivian Blake, who was at the time on the run, and Mr. Seaga, who is said to have been the real architect of the posse, would have wanted Brown dead, at such a critical moment. According to the streets, both had the money, power and influence to get it done, while still some say it was all a big hoax, organized on time to use the body of his son, Jati, who was really dead, to cover the elaborate escape plot. Hence the whole burning of the body, so identification would be hard if indeed there was a switch, which actually make conspiratorial sense, especially with Jati and Jim Brown bearing such uncanny resemblances and features, size and all. According to official reports, Jim Brown died of pulmonary edema, which is the abnormal buildup of fluid in the air sacs of the lungs, which eventually leads to shortness of breath or suffocation, or in Brown's case, his death was caused from smoke and flame inhalation. Firemen WHO were called to the then-named General Penitentiary, where Brown was being held, claimed that when they arrived, they were not taken to Brown's cell, but instead became witnesses to a heated argument, already in progress, between police officers, members of the army and prison warders, about whether or not the body of the man on the ground, who was said to be Brown, which was also already out of the cell, and had even fallen off the stretcher that it had obviously been on, was to be taken to the hospital or not. The firemen also claimed that they were there for over an hour before the body was permitted to be moved to the hospital. A hospital, which in real time, was less than 10 minutes away from the prison.